Master Sergeant Cale Dryden had a way of making a room go quiet, and he used it like a weapon. He stood at the head of the range house with a coffee gone cold in his fist, and looked down the line of shooters until his eyes landed on the smallest one, the way they always did. "Some of you carry a rifle," he said, loud enough to bounce off the tin roof, "and some of you babysit one." A few men laughed, because laughing was easier than being looked at next. Dryden tipped his chin at Della Halverson, 5'4" in her boots, 90 pounds of kit hanging off a frame that looked built for a smaller war. "The mouse here qualified on paper. We'll see what paper's worth when the wind's up and the timer's running." He let it sit. He was good at letting things sit. Della did not look up from the bolt she was cleaning, did not flush, did not square her shoulders the way the proud ones did when he came at them. Her hands kept moving, slow and even, oiling a rail that was already clean, and her breathing did not change at all. To the men, it looked like she had nothing to say. It was not that. She had heard a version of this voice her whole life, in gymnasiums and armories and one care home 1,000 miles east, and she had learned long ago that the worst thing you could do to a man like Dryden was let him watch you stay calm. She was not afraid of his timer. She was thinking about a different one, a watch with a cracked face that had stopped at 11 minutes past 4, riding in her left chest pocket against her heartbeat, and a voice that was not Dryden's saying the only thing she had ever needed to hear. "There is a shot waiting for you that no one will believe." The thought passed and left her face smooth. She fitted the bolt home, with a sound like a key turning a lock, and across the room, Dryden mistook her silence for surrender, which was the first mistake he would make, and far from the worst, because in 9 weeks he would key a radio, with his hands shaking, and say her name across a valley to 1,000 listening ears, and beg, "If you are the kind of person who sticks around to watch a story land its last punch, do me a favor before we go any further. Tap subscribe, because this channel lives and dies on it. And tell me in the comments the city you're listening from right now, whether it's a kitchen at midnight or a highway at dawn, because I read them, and it genuinely makes my week. Stay to the end. I'm asking because the moment everything turns on does not happen on a range or in a gunfight where you'd expect it. It happens with a grown man crying into a handset, refusing to say one word, and then saying it anyway. And the distance this story travels, by the time it's done, from one cold morning where everybody laughed to the thing they later carved into the side of a spotting scope and would not let anyone touch, is further than anyone in that room could have measured. Stay with me. To understand the silence, you have to go back 9 weeks, to a forward base scraped into the hills of a country whose name kept changing on the maps, where the dust got into everything, and the heat came up off the rocks at noon, like a hand laid flat against your face. The base smelled of diesel and burnt coffee and the particular ammonia bite of canvas that never fully dries. Della had arrived as a replacement, a name on a transfer list, a marksman the section had not requested and did not want, what none of them had bothered to read, because Dryden told them not to, and Colonel Aldous Frey let Dryden tell them things, was the rest of her file. Before the Army, she had shot for a national team that never sent her abroad. 1,000-yard discipline, where the targets are smaller than a thumbnail, and the wind has 8 different opinions between you and the paper. She had won things they did not give medals for, because they were not supposed to exist. And before all of that, there had been a kitchen with peeling yellow paint, and an old woman who could no longer climb stairs, but could still call a coin toss by the sound it made in the air. Margaret Halverson, her grandmother, had been a champion in a country and an era that did not let women like her compete where it counted. So she had compounded all of it down into one granddaughter and one sentence. She said the way other people say grace. Aim, Margaret would tell her, tapping the table with one bent finger, is patience wearing a uniform. She said it before competitions and after funerals, and once when Della was 9 and crying about a boy who'd laughed at her. She had pressed the stopped watch into Della's palm the day Della shipped out. Her own father's watch, frozen at 4:11, for reasons she never explained, and folded the small fingers closed over it. Time doesn't move while you're on the shot, she'd said. That's the whole secret. Everybody else is in a hurry. You won't be. There's a shot waiting for you that no one will believe, Della. Don't spend your patience before it comes. Then she'd hummed 3 low notes, the breathing tune, the one that pushed the air out slow and never let it rush back in, and that was the last lesson, and Della had carried it across an ocean in a chest pocket over her heart. Her first week, the section ran a stress drill, cold bore, unknown distance, a man yelling in your ear the whole time, the kind of theater Dryden loved. The other new shooters rushed it and threw rounds into the dirt. Della settled behind the rifle, and the world did the thing it did for her, where the yelling went thin and far away like weather happening to someone else, and she counted her breath out the way Margaret hummed it, and she did not fire when they expected her to. Dryden barked that she'd frozen. She had not frozen. She was reading a mirage shimmer twisting off the rocks at the 400 mark, a little river of heat that told her the wind down there ran opposite to the wind on her cheek, and when it stilled for half a second, she sent one round through the center of a steel plate nobody had told her was the actual target. The clang came back flat and certain. Dryden said it was luck and moved on. But over by the Connex where the armorer worked, a wiry man named Eli Sandoval looked up from the bench where he was lapping a barrel, and he watched her clear and case her rifle with the unhurried economy of someone who had done it 50,000 times. And he did not say anything, because he did not yet have the words for what he'd seen. He only filed it away. Sandoval had been turning wrenches on rifles for 22 years and had learned to read a shooter's hands the way a farrier reads a horse's legs, and her hands were telling him a story the rest of the base was too loud to hear. 2 days later, they tried to break her a different way, with the wind machine and a moving target on a rail, and she put 5 of 6 into the kill zone while it lurched and stuttered. And the one she missed she called as a miss before it landed, which is a thing only the very good can do. Dryden's jaw worked. He gave her the worst sector, the worst hours, the cot nearest the generator. He told the section she was a diversity hire, keeping a real shooter's slot warm. The men mostly believed him because believing him was free, and disagreeing with him was not. The exception was a young spotter named Bex Tallis, who had her own scar from the same knife. Tallis was 23, sharp-tongued, with a memory for numbers that bordered on the unnatural, and she'd been passed over for the section's lead spotter slot in favor of a man who couldn't read a wind flag if it slapped him. When Dryden had announced it, he'd done it the same way, in front of everyone, with a line about how she was good with a calculator, not a battlefield. Tallis had laughed it off in the moment, and then thrown up behind the ammo point where nobody could see. So when she watched Della call her own miss before it landed, Tallis walked over, sat down uninvited, and said, "You read the rail bias off the second flag, didn't you? Not the first." And Della looked at her for a long moment, the first time she'd really looked at any of them, and said 2 words. "You saw." That was all. But Tallis felt it land somewhere under her ribs, because nobody on that base had ever said she saw anything. They started eating together after that, not talking much, just running mental ballistics back and forth like a card game. One of them calling a distance and a condition, and the other returning a firing solution before the food got cold. It was the closest thing either of them had to a friendship, 2 underestimated people who had each found at last somebody who could keep up. The crisis did not knock. It never does. It came on the morning of the 4th week as a runner sprinting across the motor pool, with his boots barely touching dirt, and then as the long, flat blare of the alert tone, and then as Colonel Frey's voice over the base net sounding older than it had the night before. A convoy of engineers and local aid staff doing a water survey in the eastern wadis had driven into an ambush in a place the maps called Dead Ground, a fold in the land where no overwatch reached. 3 vehicles. Some of them were pinned in a dry irrigation channel, taking fire from high rock on 2 sides, and the relief element was 40 minutes out over bad road. And 40 minutes was a number that would get people killed. Frey needed eyes and a rifle on the ridge above the channel inside 15, and the only fast way up was a goat track that a vehicle couldn't take, which meant boots, which meant light, which meant small. He stood in the operations tent with the map glowing under his hands, and he knew, the way you know a tooth is going to need pulling, exactly who his fastest, surest pair of hands belonged to. And he knew what putting her up there in front of the whole base would say about every word he'd let Dryden speak for a month. Dryden was already volunteering, loud, certain, planting his flag. Frey looked past him. "Halverson," he said, and the tent went quiet the way the range house had gone quiet, except now it was the colonel doing it. "You and Tallis, the East Ridge, now." It cost him something to say it, and everyone heard the price. Dryden's face did a complicated thing. Frey did not look at him. "I should have put her up sooner," he said, to no one and to the whole tent, and then turned back to the map because he could not stand to watch himself mean it. She keyed the radio for the first time 11 minutes later, prone on a spine of rock with the channel laid out 340 meters below, and the heat already lifting off the stone into her chest. The men down the hill had spent a month hearing her called the mouse, the babysitter, the warm slot. What came over the net was none of those things. It was flat and unhurried and precise as a scalpel. Overwatch is set. I have eyes on the channel. 2 firing positions in the North Rocks, 1 in the South Cleft. Count of 9 hostiles that may climb. Friendlies are 6. 2 are down and moving. Hold what you're doing and let me work the high ones first. A long pause on the net. Then Frey's voice, careful. "Copy, Overwatch. You have weapons free." Down in the operations tent, a private who'd laughed at Dryden's jokes all month said, "Who is that?" And nobody answered him, because they all already knew, and none of them wanted to be the one to say it. The first shot did not sound like the range. On the range, every rifle sounds the same because the conditions are tamed. Up here, the report cracked off the canyon wall and came back doubled, a hard slap, and then its own ghost, and the man it was meant for, a fighter rising to fire down into the channel from the North Rocks, simply stopped being a problem and folded behind his cover. "One," said Talus beside her, her voice tight and bright, scope to her eye, already hunting the next. The militia in the channel were not amateurs. That was the first thing that went wrong with the easy version of this story. They understood within 90 seconds that the fire pinning them had reversed, that someone above had taken the high ground's advantage away, and they began to displace and to range the ridge in turn. A round cracked past Della's position close enough that she felt the pressure of it against the shell of her ear, a sound like cloth tearing very fast, and chips of stone stung the side of her face. "Moving!" Talus snapped, and they slid 2 meters left to a notch Della had clocked on the climb up, because Margit's voice was already in her head, plain and direct, not a metaphor, just the thing itself. You are never as hidden as you feel, so be somewhere else before they decide. She settled, found the shooter who'd ranged her, a patient man working a bolt gun from the south cleft, and waited. This was the first true danger, and time did the thing it did. She watched his muzzle drift toward their old notch. She heard the channel below, the friendlies' rifles barking in their higher, sharper register, the militia's heavier rounds chewing the vehicles, a man down there screaming a name over and over. She felt the rock bite her elbows and the watch tick of her own pulse in her throat, and the wind change its mind on her cheek, picking up from the left. 2 flags worth of disagreement between her and him. She calculated the hold the way you'd catch a falling cup, without deciding to, a touch of left edge into the wind, a hair high for the heat, thinning the air. He found their old position and fired into empty rock, and in the half-second of his surprise, she sent 1 round across the cleft, and the south position went dark. 2, said Talus. God, 2. The militia had now lost both their best high seats, and a quiet started to spread through them that Della recognized as the beginning of fear. But fear makes some men reckless. A knot of 4 broke from the channel's edge and rushed the downed friendlies in the open, hoping to overrun before the relief element arrived, and for 90 seconds the ridge became a metronome. Crack, the doubled echo, a fall. Crack, the echo, a fall. The bolts cycling between, with a sound like a stapler in a quiet office, brass spinning off into the dust. Talus called wind and lead and distance in a flat, fast stream, and Della answered with rounds, and the count climbed in Talus's mouth. 3, 4, 5, 6, each number more disbelieving than the last, until the rush was just 4 shapes, in the dirt, and the survivors had stopped moving forward entirely. Then the heavy machine gun in the North Rocks, the one weapon that could end them up here, swung its long throat toward the ridge and opened up. And this was the second true danger, and the worst of the day. The world turned to noise and grit. Rounds the size of a thumb walked across the rock in front of them, throwing fountains of stone, and the air filled with the flat hammering of it, and the whine of fragments going past. And Della pressed herself into the earth and could not lift her head without losing it. Talus was shouting the gun's position, but Della could not see it. The muzzle was tucked deep in shadow behind a slab, and all she had was its voice. So she used its voice. She listened past the gun to the echo, the way Margit had taught her to call a coin in the air. And she built the gunner in her mind from the way the sound bent off the slab. And when the gun paused to reload, she came up onto the rifle blind, settled the reticle on a shadow she could not quite see, trusted the math, and fired. The hammering did not resume. 7, Tallis breathed. Bex, you can't even see him. I heard him, Della said. Then the relief element came over the road in a rooster tail of dust, and the surviving militia melted into the rocks the way they always did. And as fast as it had begun, the ridge went quiet. Too quiet in one specific way. Tallis had been on the secondary net to the convoy the whole time, relaying, and now that net had gone silent. She called the convoy's medic, a young soldier she'd trained alongside, by name. Nothing came back but the soft hiss of an open channel. She called again, and the hiss seemed to deepen, and a third time, and there was only the empty sound of distance and a frequency carrying nothing, the loneliest sound there is. Then a different voice, ragged. The medic was down. 2 friendlies were critical in the channel, and the relief element's own corpsman had been hit coming in. There was no one to work the wounded. Della was already moving. She came off the ridge down the goat track at a controlled fall, rifle slung, and Tallis scrambled after her shouting that this wasn't her job, and Della did not answer because there was no breath to spare for it. The channel, when she dropped into it, smelled of copper and diesel and the Swedish wrongness underneath, that you never forget once you've smelled it. A woman lay against the wheel of the lead truck with both hands pressed to her own side and blood coming up bright between her fingers. Too bright, the arterial kind, and her face had gone the gray of wet ash. Her name was Yara. She was the convoy's interpreter, 31 years old, and pinned to the inside of her flak vest with a safety pin was a child's drawing of a house with too many windows, because her daughter Sahar drew houses, dozens of them, and Yara carried the newest one always, and had told the engineers just that morning that when this was over, she was going to teach school in a town with a real school, and her daughter would draw the building. None of which Della knew. What Della knew was the wound. She dropped to her knees in the dirt, and the same hands that had just done the coldest work of the day went to the warmest, fast and sure. And the section watching from the rocks above saw the mouse they had laughed at packing a wound and clamping a bleeder with the unhurried certainty of someone who had trained for exactly this, because before the rifle and before the range, Della had spent 2 years as a combat lifesaver and had kept up the cert every cycle out of the same patience that made her shooting, the patience that does the boring thing 10,000 times, so the hand knows it in the dark. Yara's eyes found her face. The interpreter's English was good, and what she said was small and clear over the noise. Am I going to see her? My daughter? Am I going to see her? Della pressed the dressing down hard and looked her dead in the eye and did not soften it into a maybe, because Margit had taught her that a frightened person needs a fact to hold, not a comfort. You're going to see her, Della said. I have you. You're not leaving. She said it the way she'd say a range, a number, a thing that was simply true. And it held Yara together long enough for the bleeding to slow under Della's hands, long enough for the bird, the medevac, to come thundering up the wadi, long enough to load her onto it with the drawing still pinned over her heart, and Yara gripped Della's wrist the whole way to the stretcher and would not let go until they made her. They flew Yara out, and the channel emptied, and the men came down off the rocks and could not look at Della and could not stop looking at her. And the easy version of the story would have ended there, with the section quietly rebuilt, and Dryden quietly diminished, and a hot meal, and a long sleep. But the two-operation truth of that country was that one crisis was just the place the next one stood up out of. By dusk, a worse thing had come over the net. The same militia, bloodied on the eastern ridge, had done something they hadn't done before. They had taken 3 of the surveyed water engineers alive in the chaos, 2 men and a woman, dragged them west through the rocks before the relief element closed the channel. And now they were holding them in the one place on the entire range of hills, designed by God to be unreachable, the far lip of the Tarn Valley, a vast dry basin nearly 4 kilometers across, a place the section's own range card simply marked as beyond. The militia's commander, a man the intelligence cell called the quarryman because he'd run the rock works before the war and knew every fold of that ground, had gone up on a flat shoulder of stone on the valley's far side, in full view across the impossible gulf, with the 3 engineers kneeling in a row in front of him, and a phone held up to film. His ultimatum came in over a captured radio in flat, patient English. The relief element that had killed his men on the eastern ridge would withdraw from the district by dawn, or he would execute the 3 on camera, 1 an hour, starting at first light. He had chosen his shoulder of rock precisely. No vehicle could cross the Tarn before dawn. The only routes around were day-long climbs the militia held. No aircraft could get close without being heard for 10 minutes and giving him all the time he needed. He was 3,800 meters from the nearest point the section could reach, the western rim of the Tarn, and 3,800 meters was a number that lived in nobody's range card because it lived beyond the longest confirmed shot any human being had ever made. He had built himself a fortress out of distance. He was, in every practical sense, anyone in the operations tent could see, completely safe. They spent the night trying to make it not so. Dryden went out to the western rim himself, because to his credit, he was not a coward, and he set up with the section's best rifle and its best glass, and he tried to build a firing solution for the quarryman's shoulder of rock, and he could not, and it broke something in him to admit it. The wind across the Tarn was not one wind. It was a stack of them, a river of cold air sliding down off the northern heights into the basin, and a warmer current rising off the day's stored heat in the valley floor, and a crosswind funneling through a notch in the southern wall. 3 currents the round would have to cross in sequence, each one peeling it a different direction, and beyond 1,500 meters, Dryden's whole experience came apart in his hands like wet paper. He fired 3 ranging shots at a marked rock near the shoulder, in the dead hours when he could risk the noise, and watched all 3 vanish into the basin without a trace. No impact, no dust, nothing, the desert simply swallowing them. And he understood, with a cold weight in his gut, that he was throwing rounds at a problem he could not even see the shape of. He sat on the rim in the dark, with the unfired solution and the certainty he'd carried for 20 years, and felt them both crack. It was Tallis who broke it open, and that mattered, because the whole thing turned on her doing it. She'd been on the rim since midnight, too, not invited, sketching the Tarn's winds into her notebook from the way the dust moved under a quarter moon. And somewhere around 3 in the morning she stopped and went very still, and then started flipping back through pages of numbers from the eastern ridge. The mirage she'd read, the way the heat had run opposite to the surface, wind down low. It cancels, she said, to herself first, and then louder. She found Della in the dark by the rifle and grabbed her arm. Della, the valley winds, the cold river off the north, and the warm rising off the floor. They're not just stacked, they're opposed. And there's a window, listen, there's a window right at first light. When the floor's given up its heat, and the cold river hasn't built yet, maybe 4 minutes, and they null each other across the middle third of the basin. Dryden's been shooting into the night when the cold river's at full song. At the seam, at gray light, the round only has to beat the near current and the far current, and the middle goes quiet. It's not 4 kilometers of wind. It's 200 meters of wind twice, with a dead river in between. She was breathing hard. I can't make the rifle do it, but I can call it. I can call you through it, if you can hold long enough to wait for the seam. Della looked at the far shoulder of rock, 4 kilometers of darkness away, a place no human shot had ever reached. And she put her hand flat against her left chest pocket, where a stopped watch sat over her heart. And she heard an old woman's voice say, "There's a shot waiting for you that no one will believe." And she said, "Then we wait for the seam." The call came at 5 minutes to first light, and it did not come from Frey. And that was the thing nobody who heard it ever forgot. The net had been a tense murmur of the relief element's commander and the operations tent arguing options that all came to nothing. And then it went quiet, a held breath of a quiet, and into it came Dryden's voice from the rim. And it was wrong. It was small. It had none of the range house in it. There was a silence first, 3 full seconds of an open key, with only his breathing on it, the sound of a man standing at the edge of saying a thing he had sworn he would never say. Then he said it. He. "Operations, this is Dryden. I can't make this shot." Another silence, worse. "Nobody on this rim can make this shot." And then, with a cost you could hear, each word dragged up from somewhere under 20 years of being the loudest man in every room. "Get Halverson up here. Get the mouse." A pause. "Get her, please. There's 3 of them kneeling, and the sun's coming, and she's the only one. I'm asking. Halverson." Down in the operations tent, the private who'd laughed at his jokes put his hand over his mouth. Frey closed his eyes. And on the rim, 400 meters back, where Della had already been waiting because Talus had read the seam, an hour before Dryden gave up, she heard him say her name, like a man laying down something he could not carry, and she did not answer on the net. She just crawled up beside him, settled in behind the long rifle he had failed with, and said to him, quietly, the only thing she ever said about it, "Spot for Talus. She has the wind." And Dryden, who had never spotted for anyone in his life, lay down in the dirt and did what the smallest soldier on the base told him to. What followed was the longest 4 minutes of every life on that rim. The east went from black to charcoal, to a thin gray bleeding up behind the far heights. And the quarryman's shoulder of rock came up out of the dark as a paler smear, with 5 smaller smears in front of it, 3 kneeling, 2 standing, and the standing one moved among the kneeling ones with the unhurried theater of a man who believed himself untouchable. Talus lay on Della's left, with her glass on the basin floor, reading the mirage as it was born in the growing light, watching the cold river off the north and the warm breath off the floor for the moment they would cancel. "Not yet," she murmured. "The floor's still giving. Hold." Della did the only thing she had ever truly been built to do. She waited. She slowed her breath to Margit's 3 low notes, out, and never rushed back in, and she felt her own pulse drop until the reticle stopped its tiny living tremble and sat still on the pale standing smear nearly 4 kilometers across the dead air. She dialed the elevation Talus fed her, an absurd amount of it, the round arcing up into a sky it would fall out of like a thrown stone, and she set the wind for the near current, and held the far in her mind, and trusted the seam to be empty, if Talus said it would be. She put her hand once on the watch in her pocket. Time doesn't move while you're on the shot. The light came up another shade. The quarryman stopped behind the first kneeling engineer and lifted something to the back of the man's head. "Now," Talus breathed, "seam's open. Send it." And Della, between one heartbeat and the next, in the stillness she had spent her whole life learning how to hold, broke the shot. The round left at a speed that meant it would fly for nearly 6 seconds, and those 6 seconds were the longest distance in the story. It rose into the gray, slowing, the near wind nudging it off Talus's call, and Talus already knowing it would, and it crossed the cold river's last thin reach, and bled left, and then it entered the seam, the dead middle third of the tarn, where the opposing winds had canceled into nothing for 4 minutes only, and it flew straight and true through the heart of the valley, while gravity hauled it back down out of the high, cold sky. And on the far side, it found the rising warm breath off the heated stone, and that pushed it the last few inches back right, exactly as much as Talus had said it would, the 2 ends of the wind paying each other back across 4 kilometers of empty air. On the rim, nobody breathed. Through the glass, Dryden watched the standing smear that was about to become a murderer. And he watched the gray light, and he watched the longest second of his life stretch out flat. And then the far figure simply went down, dropped where it stood, as if the string holding it up had been cut, a full beat before the sound of the shot ever reached them, and the 3 kneeling smears flinched and stayed kneeling and stayed alive. Then, and only then, the report of the rifle finished its own long journey across the tarn and came back to the rim as a flat, distant clap, the loneliest sound, a thing that had already done its work before anyone could hear it. Talus made a noise that was half a laugh and half a sob. Dryden took his eye off the glass and looked at the small woman beside him as if he had never in his life seen a human being before. Della worked the bolt once, the brass spinning away into the gray dirt, and lowered her forehead to the stock for exactly 1 breath. And then she was up and calling the relief element forward to take the 3 before the rest of the militia recovered, flat and unhurried. A range, a number, a thing that was simply true. They did not believe it, of course. Out across the wider net, where men who had not been on the rim listened, the word went up the chain, and the word came back down as a flat refusal. Nobody shoots a man at 3,800 meters. The longest confirmed kill in the history of the thing was shorter than that, and took a team and a perfect day. This was a panicked militia commander, shot by his own people in the dark. This was a story growing in the retelling. This was the desert and the gray light playing tricks. The relief element's commander, a careful man who'd built a career on not believing things, said as much on the net. So they proved it. And the way they proved it was nothing anyone could argue with. The section had flown a small surveillance drone high over the tarn through the whole night to keep eyes on the hostages, and that drone had been recording continuously, lens and laser rangefinder both. And when the intelligence cell pulled the footage, they had the entire thing from above. The 3 kneeling engineers, the standing commander, the timestamp, the rangefinder's own laser, painting the distance on the shoulder of rock as 3,804 meters. And then, 6 seconds after the muzzle flash registered on a second sensor, back on the western rim, the commander dropping. The flight time of the round matched the distance to the 10th of a second against the ballistics. The drone's laser and the rifle's data and the timestamp and the recovered weapon the quarryman had been holding, found beside him with his finger still through the trigger guard, all told one story and only one story, and there was no seam in it for doubt to slip through. The careful commander watched the footage twice, and then a third time, and then took off his hat in the operations tent, which the men who knew him said they had never once seen him do, and said into the quiet, "I owe somebody an apology and a drink, and I don't know which to do first." The numbers were entered into a log that the section afterward would not let anyone touch, and the distance stood, verified 6 ways, beyond anything that had been done before. And the patience that had made it was logged nowhere, because no instrument exists to measure that. The engagement was complete at 6 minutes past first light. 3 friendly persons recovered alive and unharmed. 9 hostile combatants neutralized in the Eastern Channel, and 1 hostile commander neutralized at the Western Rim. 0 friendly casualties beyond those sustained in the initial ambush, all of whom were evacuated and stabilized. The drone footage was archived. The net went to routine traffic. By full daylight, the Tarn Valley was just a wide, dry basin again, the wind already rebuilding its 3 opposed currents now that the seam had closed, the place going back to being unreachable as if it had never for 4 minutes been otherwise. The reckoning happened back in the range house, in the same square of tin-roofed shade where it had begun, and it took place in front of the section the way Dryden's cruelty always had, because he understood at last that a thing done in public has to be undone in public, or it isn't undone at all. He came in while Della was cleaning her bolt, the same slow, even motion as that first morning, and the men went quiet. But it was a different quiet now. Dryden stood where he'd stood before, with no coffee in his hand and nothing loud left in him. And when he tried to speak, his voice did the thing his rifle had done across the tarn. It failed at the distance. He started and stopped. He looked at the floor. The big shoulders that had filled every doorway on the base for a month were rounded down now, and a muscle in his jaw kept jumping. And when the words finally came, they came broken, restarting, costing him visibly. A man doing the hardest physical labor of his life, standing perfectly still. "I called you a mouse," he said. "For a month, He stopped, tried again. "I read your file the first day. That's the part I read it. I knew what was in it. And I told them not to. Because if you were what the file said, then I wasn't. His throat closed. He pressed the heel of his hand hard against one eye and held it there and breathed. And when he took it away, his eyes were wet, and he did not pretend they weren't. I've spent 20 years being the best one in the room. And the first day you walked in, I knew I wasn't anymore. And instead of learning from you, I tried to bury you in front of everybody, every day, because I was scared of a person half my size who never raised her voice once. He stood straight then, with effort, and made himself look at her. I'm sorry. It isn't enough, and I know it isn't, and I'm saying it anyway. I'm sorry. The room did not breathe. Della set the bolt down. She looked at him for a long moment, the way she'd looked at Tallis that first day. And what she gave him was not forgiveness exactly, and not absolution. It was something harder and more useful, 2 words delivered as a fact. Then teach right. That was all. But Dryden took it the way a man takes water, and something in his ruined face settled because she had not told him he was forgiven. She had told him he was not finished, which was the only thing that could have saved him. Frey came for her separately that evening and made it its own moment, because the failure had been institutional, and a man does not get to fold his own reckoning into someone else's. He found her at the edge of the base where the hills went blue with dusk, and he stood beside her without speaking for a long while, a colonel and a marksman watching the light go. And the internal struggle was plain on him, the wanting to explain himself and the knowing he had no right to. The rank that should have protected her and instead had loaned itself out as a weapon. When he finally spoke, it was slow, and it was honest in the way that costs a commander more than it costs anyone. I want to tell you it was Dryden, he said. It would be easy. He's the one who said the words. He shook his head. But I'm the one who let him say them. A man like that only runs as far as his commander lets him. And I let him run the whole length of you for a month because it was quieter for me. Your file came across my desk the same day it crossed his. I didn't read it either. I let the loudest voice in the section be the only voice. And that's not his failure. That's mine. It's the institution's. It's mine. The seam in this whole thing was me. He was quiet a moment, jaw working, the struggle of a man unaccustomed to standing in his own fault and refusing to step out of it. Then he straightened and said the rest plainly. As of that night, she was the section's senior marksman of record. Dryden would run the training cell under her standards, not his. And her file, the real one, the whole one, would go up the chain with his endorsement attached and his name on the line for every word of it. Then he turned to her, and the recognition, when it came, was 3 words, and it carried everything the month had not. We failed you, he said. Not she earned it, not good shooting. We failed you. An officer saying the one sentence officers are built never to say, and meaning it. And it was worth more than any medal because of what it cost the man to put it in the air. What Dryden did next was the proof that the apology had been more than words, and he did it without being asked. 3 weeks on, a new draft of replacements arrived, and one of them, a big confident shooter, fresh from a school where he'd been top of his class, took one look at Della running the line and made the old joke, the warm slot joke, the babysitter joke. Loud, the way it was always done. The section went still and braced for it, and Dryden, who 3 months earlier had authored that exact joke, crossed the range house in 4 strides and got very close to the new man and said, low enough that it was almost worse than loud, "You see that rifle on the rack? The one nobody touches, with the distance scratched into the scope rail?" She made that shot. 3,800 meters. The one you read about and didn't believe. That's hers. You will not say one more word about her in my hearing or in hers. And you will spend the next 6 weeks trying to be worthy standing on her line, the way I should have. And if you're lucky, she'll teach you something I was too proud to learn until I had to beg her to save my hostages over a radio in front of the whole district. Then he stepped back and said, to the whole stunned line, in the voice that used to make rooms go quiet for cruelty, and now made them go quiet for something else, "She's the standard here. I'm just the one who tried to break it and couldn't." The new man did not say another word, and Della, cleaning a bolt at the bench, did not look up. But the corner of her mouth moved, the closest thing to a smile the section ever got out of her, because the change in him was not in what he said, but in the fact that he'd planted himself between her and the joke instead of throwing it. The running tally from the Eastern Channel settled when the section reconciled it against the recovered evidence and the convoy survivors' accounts at a whole and verified number, separate entirely from the one shot across the tarn that nobody counted because it could not be counted. 9 in the Channel called out one by one in Bex Tallis's bright, disbelieving voice as they happened. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 2 more in the close fight at the end. 9 confirmed, a number the men said over and over for weeks, because saying it was the only way to start to hold it. Eli Sandoval, the armorer who'd watched her case a rifle that first week and known something the rest of the base was too loud to hear, was the one who scratched the distance into the scope rail of the rifle on the rack, and he did it the night the drone footage came back, and he did it without telling anyone. And when they asked him why he'd marked a weapon that way, he wiped his hands on a rag and looked at the rifle for a while before he answered. Sandoval had patched up Yara's flak vest among the recovered gear, had found the child's drawing of the house with too many windows still pinned inside it, had heard the interpreter ask from her hospital bed about the small woman who'd held her side together and made her a promise like a fact. And what he said, the simplest and truest thing anyone on that base said about any of it, the gut-level summary that the men carried home, was this: "She doesn't shoot to kill anybody. I've watched her 100 hours now. She shoots so somebody else gets to go home. There's a difference, and it's the whole difference, and it's why I marked the rail. Not for the kill, for the 3 that walked off that valley floor, for the drawing." Then he hung the rifle back on the rack and would not let anyone touch it. Yara lived. She wrote Della one letter, months later, in careful schoolteacher's English, and it said that she was teaching now, in a town with a real building, and that Sahar had drawn the school with so many windows you could not count them all, and that she told her daughter every night about the woman who had looked her in the eyes when she was most afraid and given her a fact to hold instead of a kindness, and that this, Yara wrote, was the bravest thing anyone had ever done for her, braver than the shooting, to refuse to lie to a frightened person. Della read it once and folded it and put it in the chest pocket alongside the stopped watch over her heart, where she kept the things that were simply true. And the theme of the whole of it, the thing none of them could have said at the start, got said at the end by Talus, on a night a long time after, when the two of them sat on the western rim again, with the tarn dark and quiet below, and the three opposed winds rebuilding in the basin the way they always would. Talus was turning her notebook over in her hands. The one with the seam were in it, and she said, "Everyone thinks it was the shot, the distance. They think you're the best because of the 4 kilometers." And Della watched the dark valley and was quiet for a while, and then she said the longest thing she ever said to anyone, which was still not very long. The shot was 4 minutes of holding still. Anybody fast enough to make it would have taken it in the dark and missed. It wasn't the distance, it was the waiting. My grandmother used to say, "Aim is patience, wearing a uniform." She put her hand flat on her chest pocket. Everybody else was in a hurry that morning. The quarry man was in a hurry. Dryden was in a hurry for 20 years. I just wasn't. She looked at Talus. "And it was your seam. I gave you the shot. You called me through it. That's the part nobody writes down." Talus didn't answer, because there wasn't anything to add to it, and they sat with the winds coming back over the rim until it was time to go. A long way east, in a kitchen with peeling yellow paint, an old woman who could no longer climb stairs heard from her granddaughter for the first time in months. A short letter, the only kind Della wrote, that said only that the shot had come, the one no one would believe, and that she had waited for it the way she'd been taught, and that the watch had been in her pocket the whole time, and time had not moved at all. Margit Halvorsen read it twice. Then she set it down on the table and tapped it once with one bent finger, the way she'd tapped 1,000 lessons into a small girl who never raised her voice. And she smiled at the window, and she was not surprised, because she had known since the child was 9, and crying about a boy who'd laughed at her, that there was a shot waiting out there that no one would believe, and that her granddaughter would not spend her patience before it came. Della cleaned her bolt at the bench that evening, slow and even, the same motion as the first morning, her breathing unchanged, her eyes level, the stillness in her that had once looked like surrender, and was now understood across an entire district to be the most dangerous thing on the base. She fitted the bolt home with a sound like a key turning a lock. She did not need to prove anything to anyone anymore, and so she didn't, and that was the peace she had earned. And in a town somewhere west, a man who had once called her a mouse and now ran a training cell to her standards stood on a line and taught a draft of frightened replacements. The first lesson, the only one that mattered, the one he'd had to beg a small silent woman over a radio to learn. That the loudest shooter on the range is almost never the best. That the best one is the one who can wait. And that somewhere out past every distance you think you know there is a shot waiting that no one will believe. And you had better not spend your patience before it comes.